Hello everyone, this is Miranda. I am here in my apartment in Shorewood. It's a little late at night, but I personally think I work best at night. I'm definitely a night owl, so I feel like a lot of what I'm about to discuss would make more sense than if I were to, after a long day at work at 5:30. So here we go. Today I am discussing, let me just scroll back up, La Consciencia de la Mestiza, which means Towards a New Consciousness by Gloria Anzaldua. My Spanish isn't great, so bear with me with some of the words. I may trip over them. But basically, Anzaldua is talking about the importance of intersectionality. I think that's really at the core what this whole article is about, is just why we should acknowledge the importance of how experiences aren't universal and how certain aspects of your identity often collide. So for example, Anzaldua is she's a mixed race, half Mexican lesbian. So her experience as a Mexican gay woman is very different from that of for example, a white gay woman. She's definitely struggled more with different senses of self because of the intersections of her race. Because La Mestiza, I looked it up, basically means a woman of Latin American origin who is mixed race. So that's basically what it means. So she talks a lot about the Mestiza as in the third person. So kind of just separating her own experiences as a concept. So she goes on page 2 about her internal struggle between her beliefs of white culture and Mexican culture and indigenous culture. So she is really taking a moment to self-reflect and how a lot of patriarchal white conventions, as she mentions in the bottom of page 2, have counteracted with all of her other experiences being Mexicana. So basically she talks about how male dominant culture has, for the most part, negatively impacted her cultural experience. So that said, she takes a moment to analyze her culture and how the way that Mexican culture kind of comes from both indigenous culture and European Spanish culture, and how growing up her father really struggled with that sense of identity, and because of the nature of how a lot of Latin American culture has come to be because of Spanish colonialism in indigenous populations in Central America and Mexico, and basically she alludes to in her article when talking about her father is that the being macho, machismo, she talks about all of this and about making the concept of woman be congruent with weakness. She has this whole passage where it says, "Tu no sirves para nada, you are good for nothing. Eres pura vieja, you are nothing but a woman." And how that, she says right here on page 4, the modern meaning of the word machismo is, as well as the concept, is actually an Anglo invention. So essentially she's saying that toxic masculinity descends from white supremacy. So the kind of this idea that men are superior and women are inferior kind of comes from the way gender roles were subscribed through a very European lens, because in many indigenous cultures, the existence of non-binary identity has been around for hundreds of years. The best example I can think of is the Zuni tribe Nuevo Mexico, where the concept of two-spirit, which is distinctly an indigenous identity, has always existed. So with that being said, like with colonialism and with the anglicizing of Central American countries that had large indigenous populations, it's basically more or less that toxic masculinity came from gender roles, which came from Eurocentric values. And because of this being subscribed onto men of color, the concept of machismo is so deeply embedded that it has become adopted into Latinx culture, as well as in Black culture and Asian culture, the mentality of the macho, which unfortunately, as she goes on in her article, talks about how that gives way to homophobia. And she basically is saying, like, growing up, like, her father struggled with his sense of identity between, like, his roots and she says, a false machismo which leads him to put down women and even brutalize them. Coexisting with his sexist behavior is a love of the mother which takes precedence over all others. Devoted son, macho pig. To wash down the shame of his acts, of his very being, and to handle the brute in the mirror, he takes to the bottle, the snort, the needle, and the fist. So basically, she alludes to the fact that her father turned to substance abuse to cope with a lot of his own issues, which she later goes on in the next paragraph to say that yes, we understand where these roots of chauvinism come from, but that doesn't, excuse or justify the way women end up becoming abused. So the point I'm kind of getting at here is that Anzaldua is really stressing the perspectives of intersectionality, and she's talking about how the collective consciousness that could potentially happen if we acknowledge identities is, which I think is really interesting because it's not necessarily anti-identitarian, but it's because it acknowledges that, we are all different, and that's, what unites us. That's what kind of brings us together. And she made this really interesting point about how gay people of color or queer people of color often have more of a knowledge of other cultures because of the way it coincides with their sexual orientation. So, like, an experience that I can think of is, like, for me personally, a lot of my white friends asking me if I ever came out to my family, and me saying no because of, like, my family's values and how I couldn't be out to my extended family because I'm half Filipino, and they're on my mom's side of the family, we are very Catholic. And so that was just an aspect of myself that I never felt was necessary to reveal, that I wasn't really comfortable with revealing, because the cultural barrier between my family and myself was just, for me, it felt impenetrable. So that's something I really struggled with. And that's what I think she's really getting at here. Aside from that, I do have a few, like, criticisms of this article. Like, it's very binary enforcing. I definitely feel like Anzaldua could have talked more about the existence of non-binary in indigenous Mexican culture. I think that's really important. I think that's something that should have been worth bringing up when she's talking about, like, the importance of a collective conscience and how, like, in creating a collective consciousness, you have to take gender roles and dissect them. So yeah, that's kind of my whole analysis of the article. I guess yeah, no, I thought it was a good article. I enjoyed it. It definitely helped me brush up on my Spanish. And I am really happy that we're reading a lot of articles in this class written by like Kimberly Crenshaw and Audre Lorde, you know, like women of color, to get like more of a woman of color perspective on feminism that I feel like often goes ignored, especially in pop culture. So yeah. Yeah, that's me. Have a good night.